Good morning, everyone. Good morning,
Good morning.
everyone.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you coming into our call today. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome. Welcome to this year's Juneteenth celebration at Fielding Graduate University. It's so good to see you, as I say, even if I don't see you in person. It's a pleasure to gather our community together virtually today. I hope you are well, no matter where you find yourself in the world. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge a few of the trustees who are with us today, and namely Lenneal Henderson, who will be part of the program today. And how much we appreciate you being here today, Dr. Henderson. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as a Fielding trustee, you've been such an essential part of the community leadership for such a long time. As well, I see that Trustee Nicholas Smith is also on the call with us, also a faculty member at Fielding. And thank you for being here today as well, Dr. Smith. It is a pleasure. There may be other trustees on the call that I will acknowledge as they come into the call and as I see them on the list. Just want to say that I want to remind us what Juneteenth, the historical context is for the reason that we've declared it a federal holiday. 159 years ago, in June 1865, Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas. This is when we think some of the earliest celebrations began. The purpose of their arrival was to ensure that hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans in the United States were emancipated. This signaled the end of the Civil War, but this was more than 2 years after President Lincoln had declared the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. The celebrations that ensued in 1865 after this announcement, became known as Juneteenth. Today, it's considered the longest-running African-American holiday, and it became a federal holiday in 2021. And Fielding will honor this holiday on the day, which Juneteenth is tomorrow, June 19th. Today, I think it's important that we reflect together on this milestone in American history. It's an opportunity to acknowledge the contributions and sacrifices of those who fought for freedom and justice. We continue to expand our knowledge, while we also continue to honor the resilience and enduring legacy of the African American community. For example, at Fielding, in our way, we do what we can. The Black Student Association has been a powerful force, hosting frequent speaker series. We also have the Ruth Ellen Josselson Chair for Qualitative Inquiry and the Alonzo Center for Psychodynamic Studies. Both of these entities have hosted diverse lectures on a myriad of topics concerning these issues. For example, on June 1st, the Josselson Chair event featured a discussion on the African diaspora group and the experiences of Black graduate students in the academy. And we know the work is not done. This is an ongoing process for Fielding, for higher educational institutions, and for our society. But here at Fielding, we're committed to commemorating our African American and Black communities through events like our Juneteenth celebration, this one today, through our strategic plan in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and in other ways throughout the year, both in person and virtually. Some of our students and alumni dissertations focus on African American leadership. For those of you on the faculty and student body and alumni and members of the Alumni Association, you can go to our library and easily search for all of the dissertations on these matters: African American leadership, identity, aging, belonging, and much more. For example, one of our graduates in 2023 from the School of Human and Organization Development, Dr. Sherilyn Jefferson Page, wrote a dissertation titled Finding Joy Among African American Women Veterans. Clinical psychology alum Dr. Talia Bragg centered her dissertation on stress exposure during childhood and adolescence as risk factors for early cognitive aging in African Americans. As I said, these are just two stellar examples of the kinds of research that's conducted at Fielding. I want to thank the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Black Student Association, and every member of our Fielding community. Because of you all in these efforts, we can continue to advocate for social justice in our own scholarship, in our research, and in our practice. And through our hearts and our actions, our research and practice, I hope we can all honor the spirit of Juneteenth every day. So thank you for being with us today. I will now turn over the program to our Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes. Before I do so, Dr. Davis White-Eyes, I just also want to say that I want to acknowledge Fielding Trustee A.G. Green, who has also joined the call. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Green. So Dr. Davis White-Eyes, if you will take us to the next part of the program.
Thank you so much, President Rogers, for those lovely introductory remarks. And at this time, in honor of the Indigenous peoples of these lands, I would like to ask that we take the time to reflect on the importance of Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation. If you would join me, please drop in the chat where you may be located right now on Native land. In a talk that James Baldwin gave some years ago, he said, "If you try to cling to safety, then you have no life at all." Our responsibility in this, our life, is to try to deal with each other and work towards each other's freedom. Black history is tied in the very idea of freedom, and that idea of freedom and liberation is intrinsically tied to the soil of the Indigenous Americas, where stolen Indigenous people from Africa were forced to labor on stolen Indigenous lands here in the Americas. Let us take this time during our land acknowledgement to recommit ourselves to the ideals that freedom holds, to the emancipation of the heart and the soul, and the rekindling of the Indigenous notions of kinship. Thank you for allowing that reflection. And now I would like to introduce to you our amazing speaker, Dr. Lenneal Henderson. Dr. Henderson is a globally esteemed urban scholar with over 30 years of experience. He has delivered lectures and provided consultancy services on a wide array of topics, including housing issues, energy management, environmental policy, and public management. His expertise has been sought by the federal, state, and local governments, as well as by corporate and nonprofit sectors. Dr. Henderson currently serves as the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and holds the distinguished title of Eminent Scholar at Virginia State University in Petersburg, Virginia. In addition, Dr. Lenneal Henderson serves as a mentoring faculty member for the Educational Leadership for Change doctoral program at the Fielding Graduate University. As a scholar, academician, and most importantly, humanitarian, Dr. Henderson's contributions to the Academy have been recognized through various honors, including being awarded the Distinguished Chair in Teaching by the University of Baltimore. Today, Dr. Henderson will share a presentation entitled Juneteenth and Beyond, celebrating 3 great moments in civil rights. In this special presentation, Dr. Henderson will share insights regarding the 3 most decisive moments in civil rights history: Juneteenth, Brown versus Board of Education, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So with that, I now turn this over to you, Dr. Henderson. Thank you for joining us today.
Good, thank you. And can everyone hear us? Yes, no? Hello?
Yes, I hear you, Lenneal.
Yes.
All right, very good. Thank you. Let me just update a couple of things Dr. White-Eye said. First of all, let me thank her for inviting me to do this in the company of my most favorite people and my most favorite institution. I am no longer the dean at Virginia State. I had to step down during the COVID crisis, as many of us did. And so they gave me 2 titles that are both very humorous. I have to share this with you. One is Senior Fellow, which I translate to mean old man. And the other is Eminent Scholar, which says I should be wearing robes like Ben-Hur or something like that. But it's a privilege to be associated with that HBCU. It keeps me grounded in many ways. It's very much interrelated with our work at Fielding. So I just wanted to mention that. And Brian, we're going to roll this, right? You're going to roll this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let's go forward, and because we want to reserve some time for some exchange between you and me and us as we go forward. So why three critical historical milestones, and why connected to Juneteenth? As President Rogers just pointed out very well and very clearly, uh, the Juneteenth celebration comes from the announcement on June 19th of 1865 to some 2,200 slaves in Galveston, Texas, that they were indeed free by law. And I emphasize free by law. So we'll go next slide. So 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 250,000 or more Black slaves in Louisiana and Texas did not know that they were free of slavery by law. And most of the leadership of the defeated South tried to replace slave codes with something called Black codes, which did everything but re-enslave those Black folks who did know that the law had emancipated them. So they tried to obstruct all of their rights as citizens, property ownership, holding office, etc. So seen as both a violation of the terms of the ceasefire of the Civil War and the resistance to those terms that emancipated and incorporated former slaves, the Union imposed martial law on the South, dividing the South up into 5 military districts, each one headed by a Union officer, military officer. So it was through one of those officers, Gordon Granger, that the news of emancipation reached those 2,200 or so slaves in Galveston, Texas. So the Union troops were deployed into areas of the former Confederacy that resisted freedom for Black people most intensely. And one of those Union generals, by the way, was Otis Howard, after whom Howard University is named. So Granger shared with these individuals order number 3, which was the equivalent of an executive order in those days, and was read and explained to the Black slaves until they understood that they were free by law and that they were protected by law. They celebrated widely and often and wildly. Some remained in Texas, but others moved to large cities and other communities throughout the South and the North, and then eventually some moved to the West. Some of us have relatives who are descended from that group of slaves to Galveston. I remember in San Francisco meeting the great singer who's still living, Johnny Mathis, who was born in Gilmer, Texas, and he was one of the descendants. His folks were one of the descendants of this 2,000 group who heard this news on Juneteenth. Now, Du Bois, who we all know as an outstanding scholar and major contributor as an activist to civil rights, did his doctoral dissertation on the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States between 1673 and 1883. So he documented the existence of slave trading 20 years after the emancipation and 15 years after Juneteenth. The announcement did not stop either slavery or slave trading. Okay. So let's go on to the next one there if we can. Okay, so why are we connecting Brown versus the Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act to Juneteenth? They are essentially related and lineal descendants of each other. So Southern resistance to integration eventually triumphed in 3 interrelated public policies. One was, of course, the defeat of Reconstruction, culminating in the 1876 presidential election between Tilden and Hayes, where Hayes, the Republican, promised the resumption of control of the racial situation to the Democrats in the South if they would support him, and they did, and he won. The terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan and the White Knights proceeded. They were given a license, essentially, to terrorize the former slaves. However, the Supreme Court, the decision invalidating the 1875 Civil Rights Act, a Public Accommodations Act, was another blow to the march toward full incorporation and freedom. There was the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which still is on the books, by the way, and that became the basis for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And had the 1875 Civil Rights Act been incorporated as a set of constitutional amendments, it might have lasted, but it didn't. So it was invalidated. And then right behind that, in 1896, we had the Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, based on the case in my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana, where a fair-complected Black man by the name of Homer Plessy tried to defy the segregation, separate but equal doctrines of both the state of Louisiana and the country, by sitting in a part of the streetcar where he was not allowed. And he was promptly arrested, he and his colleagues. And they deliberately did this to test the law. So it made its journey to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, by a 7-1 margin, declared that we could be as separate as the fingers on the hand and still be equal. Now, you go figure that logic, but this is set in place a long effort for 58 years to challenge this interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And in the cases that came up before the courts, most of which were defeated before 1954, there was a reference made back to both the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth. So, although Juneteenth continued to be celebrated, especially in Texas, and although black folks in the 3rd Ward of Houston, Texas, even today, have what they call Emancipation Park, emancipation was not a reality. Next. So 58 years after Plessy, and 99 years after Juneteenth, the US Supreme Court would rule 9-0 that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It was a very difficult road to that decision because Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, had argued cases in a number of states challenging the legality of the 14th Amendment's interpretation in Plessy. And so what happened was, when they first argued the case in 1952, they didn't get much traction. And so one of the justices, Felix Frankfurter, suggested that they go back and try to address one question in retrying the case, and that is, did the authors of the 14th Amendment, mostly radical Republicans in Reconstruction, intend for integration to be achieved in the public schools? So they brought in all kinds of expert witnesses. This is important to us at Fielding because it emphasizes the role of scholarship and inquiry in social change and challenging injustice. And so what essentially happened was that when they came back with the case, Thurgood Marshall hired a Black psychologist, Dr. Williams would be proud of this one, by the name of Kenneth Clark, and his wife, Amy Clark, both PhDs in psychology, social psychology, who actually conducted studies, especially the Dahl study, to document the warped mentality that segregation in public schools, imposed on Black children, because the white superintendents would not allow these scholars to interview anybody white, whether they were students, faculty, or staff. And so most of the data was based on the statements and the constructions of young Black children. usually between the ages of about 6 and 14. And so this was very compelling evidence brought to the court. And John W. Davis, who represented the South Carolina in the Briggs versus Elliott case, one of the other 4 cases that were involved, tried to use the statements of W.B. Du Bois to argue the point that Black folks were much happier with their own, no matter what the conditions were, and that there was no need to do anything beyond what South Carolina was doing. And of course, Marshall and his team rebutted that. So, like with the Emancipation Proclamation, once the Supreme Court issued its ruling on a 9-0 basis under the leadership of Earl Warren, who had only been Chief Justice for less than a year when the decision was rendered, there was massive resistance to the decision. And this resistance took all kinds of forms, from outright violence and refusal to not informing folks that the law had actually been passed, because not everyone had access to newspapers and radio or any other means of communication at that time. So many did not know of the court's decision for some years, very much like Juneteenth. And so as a result, 81 members of the House, mostly from the South, and 19 US senators, mostly from the South, came up with the Southern Resolution, it was called, which essentially said to the court, no, we won't. And they didn't for a number of years. In the state of Virginia, where I reside right now, that resistance was led by Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia. And some school superintendents actually closed the public schools rather than to comply with the order of the courts. And here in Virginia, the public schools were actually closed to everyone for almost 10 years. White folks got educated by going to private academies that were sponsored by Southern philanthropy, but most of the schools were closed, and therefore closed to Black people, and they had to find another way to educate themselves as well. So force was necessary, as we remember in Little Rock, Arkansas, and as we remember in Alabama. Troops were sent in, National Guard troops were sent in to enforce the federal law. Very much reminiscent of the Juneteenth experience. Moving on here, if we go to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 10 years later, okay, the work of not only Thurgood Marshall, but Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, many others, Mahalia Jackson, we can go down a long list, Dorothy Bates, resulted in mass protests in the streets. The Selma March not only produced the Voting Rights Act of 65, but helped to produce the Civil Rights Act of 64. This act was not just the work of Kennedy and Johnson. There were members of Congress who stepped up under pressure from advocacy groups, people like Everett Dirksen of Illinois, a Republican, of course, Adam Clayton Powell in his role as chair of the House Education and Labor Committee helped to put this bill through and to get it through the Congress, something that would be very difficult to do, if not impossible today. So the Civil Rights Acts, as I mentioned, had been enacted in 1866, 1875, 1954, and 1960 prior to the 1964 Act, but none were as consequential or as expansive as the Civil Rights Act, which focused on access to public accommodations, discrimination on the basis of race and employment, and eventually, in its amended form 5 years later, would include gender and the federal government, state government, as well as race and private employment. So descendants of enslaved Africans were formally informed that the law freed them to pursue any employment or any type of public accommodation they believed they could perform or access. So Title VII in particular would eventually apply to gender as well as race, as I mentioned before, and would be the foundation for future civil rights acts passed, particularly while Johnson was president. Um, Two other civil rights acts that were passed that we should mention is, of course, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which was called the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race in leasing and renting and selling of houses and property, and the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, which protected the rights or attempted to protect the rights of indigenous people who were not living on reservations. Those also came into existence in 1968 before Johnson left the presidency. So moving on, the reason that we focus on these issues, and I think President Rogers gave us a good introduction to this, is that when we are attempting to make social change, transformative change, etc., there are going to be struggles and setbacks. There's going to be a lot of death and mayhem comes with the struggle. And so even when we achieve a victory, such as Juneteenth or the Brown decision or civil rights or anything else, it's never complete. There's still more to be done. It still needs to be enforced. Vigilance and persistence and struggle is the best contribution to sustainability of these policies and adapting them and adjusting them as they go forward. Change, as we know from our experience at Fielding, requires scholar activists like ourselves, who are trying to understand empirically what's going on, as well as to make a contribution to what should go on. And it's not insignificant that in Brown and in the testimony before the Congress for the Civil Rights Act, scholarship was mentioned by people such as Gunnar Myrdal in The American Dilemma, of course, the works of W.E.B. Du Bois, the scholarly work of Justice Constance Baker Motley, who was the first Black female federal judge, the works of people like Jack Forbes, who documented extensively the indigenous experience with slavery, and there was slavery there, and with efforts to change the laws and the policies. So the scholarship is indispensable. I mentioned the Clarks, and there were many others who testified. Many white scholars who actually testified during Brown. People like C. Van Woodward, people like Richard Hofstadter, the historian. There are many, many examples here. And even white lawyers, such as Charles L. Black, had a very interesting coincidental name. But anyway, Black was not only a lawyer, but a comparative literature scholar who volunteered his time with Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Civil Defense and Legal Defense Fund. And it was Charles L. Black who wrote the first 2 paragraphs of the Brown brief, starting with the phrase, "These tiny appellates," referring to the children in Brown and in the 4 other cases. So it also says essentially that the indigenous worldview and consciousness informs current and future strategy. So we don't subtract the Black experience with Juneteenth or anything else from the indigenous experiences. We're in Texas when this happens. Very strong state when it comes to indigenous dynamics and history and influence, etc. So we connect those things. And even here in rural Virginia, where I live, there are coalitions between the 5 great indigenous communities that live here and the African American community. So we've always interconnected these struggles. And then coalition, therefore, and diversity is indispensable to effective action. But in the end, it's very important for us to keep the faith because, as Adam Clayton Powell said, if you don't keep the faith, you lose everything. And we are in an era now where we have leading politicians who are attempting to deny the criticality of race in our system, who don't understand that really any progress we make as a people, they make as a nation. Uh, so they don't realize that the emancipation was not just about emancipating slaves, it was also emancipating slave owners and oppressors and people who diminish their humanity by indulging in these kinds of practices. So we are happy to share those few observations with you. I don't want to go on because I want to do, go to some exchange between us. But today, the legacy of many of the things that we've talked about today are all over our situation. And I remember as a student at Berkeley back in the 1960s, that's a long time ago. I had an afro back then, now I have an afterfro. But um, we formed a number of organizations that focused on the experience of Black people, of non-white people in the various disciplines that we study. And I remember being present as a member of the board of directors of the Westside Mental Health Center in San Francisco when one of the chapters and eventually a national organization of Black psychologists was founded. And it was a great day. It was a great moment. They recognized that their discipline had a lot to do with understanding the racial situation, understanding its history, its systems, and with whatever we're going to do to emancipate ourselves from those systems. I remember the founding and one of the founders of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. I remember Black sociologists, Black social workers, uh, the founding of the National Economics Association, which are the Black and Third World economists. And all of them go back to these historical moments as influential in their and inspirational in their formation and development, even today. So we are doing this not just to acknowledge and celebrate Juneteenth and all of the other critical moments in civil rights, but also to resolve that we are going to continue our struggle for full incorporation and equality in this society for the good of the country as well as for the good of each population group involved. So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share those few observations with you, and I hope we have a chance to now engage in a little discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. Wonderful presentation, lots to consider and think about. And what we'll do is have our wonderful fielding community drop in some questions in the chat, and I'm happy to field some of those questions as they come in. So any questions or reflections that you have, please drop them into the chat, and I will be monitoring that. And while you all are thinking about some questions, I do have a question for you, Dr. Henderson. First of all, thank you for this very insightful presentation. It sort of, in my mind takes me back to when I was a small child, because I was a very small child when some of these things were happening as regards civil rights. But as I get older, I think about just the amazing impact that time period had on the United States of America and what it means to uphold the ideals and values that this nation is founded upon. And, as I reflect on that, I think, well, the Civil Rights Act is really what this country is about. This is a pluralistic democracy. This is making it come into action. And of course, we have to keep that going. I'm curious, there's been recent attempts across our nation to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'd like to hear from you. Where do you think we're headed in these interesting times?
It's a good question, and I think we're headed for intense battle, not only in politics, but in economics and in world affairs as well. Because what's different about today, among other things, is that the global community is much more influential in the domestic experience than it was back when we were fighting those times. It was influential then, but it's now definitely influential. But I think we have to resist, fight, and keep on our path no matter what. So here in Virginia, our governor, Republican, his first act as governor was to issue a gubernatorial executive order banning the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. And had his staff done any research whatsoever, this is where we come in, he would have discovered that there was not a single public school in the state of Virginia teaching something with the name critical race theory. So he didn't do his homework. But anyway, many of the local school districts have resisted and not enforced that executive order. So that's a good thing. So we have to take account of the fact that there's still people out there who believe in this dream, who believe in this struggle, and who are willing to go to the maximum to make sure it gets done. I think the other thing that we need to do is to keep encouraging dissertations like those mentioned by Dr. Rogers, because our scholars and our faculty are currently engaged in all kinds of research that are related to this struggle, and we should identify them, uplift them, and continue to support them. And then the third thing I would just mention quickly is that we ought to continue to have exchanges like this. And thanks to you, since you've been our VP of DEI, we've had more of these discussions and more of these exchanges, which result in dissertations and work in the community. So we thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Henderson. That was a wonderful response. And I want to tie a comment, or actually a question that was dropped in the chat from one of our colleagues here, because it ties in very nicely to your response. So, you know, it's wonderful for us to step up and be a part of this struggle, but how do you recommend that we combat the inevitable battle fatigue that comes with the realization that no victory is final?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is that we've learned from our indigenous brothers and sisters the importance of pace in a struggle. That is, you have to stop it sometimes and regroup. I mean, even for people who are Christians, you remember Christ occasionally had to go to that place in the hills. It says to pray. Actually, it meant to chill. So you have to take care of yourself. This is one of the things that Dr. Williams has shared with me, is that as busy as she is and as hard as she works, she takes care of herself in the name of being able to do those duties she's empowered with. And we have to do that. The problem with dedicated people is that they don't know often what their minds, bodies, and souls can endure. And so they don't take a break and they break down. And I remember interviewing James Foreman, a civil rights leader and one of the first leaders of SNCC, who said he felt he hadn't done anything. He was so burnt out, I mean, he could hardly talk. And he said, the mistake I made was that I didn't indulge or engage a tradition that is true of people who are oppressed. And that is, they find a way to have fun. They find a way to take a break. They find a way to pace themselves so that they don't burn out on behalf of their people too soon and too thoroughly. And so I look at some of the older veterans of the civil rights struggle now, those that are still living, and I see them depreciated. I see Kathleen Cleaver, you know, Alzheimer's. You know, I see people like Daisy Bates and others who went through real health struggles as they got to the end of their lives. And part of it was that they were so immersed, so dedicated, that they either did not take care of themselves or they wouldn't accept the efforts of others to take care of them. And so I think we got to pace, we got to do that. So that's why mental health is so critical. That's why physical health is so critical. And some of the colleagues that I went to school with who were involved in Black student unions and indigenous groups, et cetera, who are now in their 70s, 80s, et cetera, are saying essentially that they would have not depreciated so much if they had paced themselves. And if they had listened to the counsel of wiser folks who said, let somebody else get involved here too. You know, I mean, this is not your struggle alone. And so that comes to mind right away because I've seen that happen in our experience.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. I have another question for you, and this has to do with the many struggles and movements that are going on right now, not only in our country, but around the world. And I'd like to hear your reflections on the differences between struggles and movements today and the struggles and movements during the civil rights time. And are there lessons to be learned in those struggles and movements? I mean, this is purely an opinion question. So I mean, I'd just like to hear what you think of that.
Well, I think there are key differences. One is the role of mass media and social media. Now we are in touch moment by moment rather than, struggle by struggle or month by month, and so one of the dangers here is that you can saturate yourself with the media infrastructure. So that's a big difference. When we were a lot younger, there were 3 television stations. That was it. Then came cable TV, and then came what we have now. And then on top of that, we have the internet and social media, mass media. And the first question my grandchildren asked me, Granddad, are you on Facebook? And I said, no, at my age, I'm on Facebook, But but that's the first thing they want, is they want a cell phone. They want to be able to participate in this social media dynamic that we're dealing with. So that's a big difference. The other is that I think the role of women is much more appreciated now than it was before, even though it's not fully appreciated in my view. The women have been many things to us in these movements. A font of wisdom, a source of caring, a reminder that it's about family and not just about individuals, and the intelligence, the sort of the griots of our experience, And so one of the, probably the only major critique I had of the early civil rights movement was that it didn't appreciate fully the role of women. You have to remember that when Martin Luther King got up to give that "I Have a Dream" speech, that was not the speech he was planning to give. He was urged by Mahalia Jackson from the audience to tell him about the dream. And he loved and respected Mahalia Jackson. And it was a wise choice. When we think of the people who died trying to integrate facilities, white and black, the majority of them were actually women. The majority were women. We can start with Viola Liuzzo. We go down a whole list of them. So I think that would be a different dynamic today. I think that we are beginning to appreciate. I'm going to say we're not there yet, but we're beginning to appreciate the role of women. I also think that we are much more diversified in who we are advocating for in these movements, because we started with race, mostly black and white, and then we also got to a point where we're dealing with the Latino community, with the indigenous community, with people with different sexual orientations. It's broadened its base, and they've used many of the same tactics and strategies that were used in the early civil rights movement. So I think that's different, and we see that actually in our institutions, because when I first started teaching in a faraway galaxy a long time ago, about 70% of my students were males. Today, 70% of them were females, and that 70% is much more manifest in the leadership of the institutions, both the student organizations and eventually societal organizations, than I saw when I was growing up. So those are just a couple of quick things that come to mind.
Well, those are excellent. And this ties into a question that one of our colleagues has just dropped in the chat. They would like to know, can you share more strategies with how to infuse our country and world with this shared humanity imperative, that freedom and inclusion of Black people and marginalized people is in effect an honor to, is a way to honor ourselves, all of us?
Correct. I think the first thing is to check our own practice, because there are times when I take a little break and I reflect on what I'm doing allegedly in the cause of some justice issue or a rights issue, then I'm not doing it correctly. That I've miscalculated some strategy, that I have been involved in some micro or macro aggression towards a person or a group. So we have to constantly be in a reflective mode. I don't mean self-absorbed. I mean constantly checking what we're doing. We evaluate everything else. We should certainly evaluate our own behavior, both through our own lens and through the lens of those that we work with. I think the other thing is that we should be exposed, get out more. One of the things I like about fielding is that we urge people to go into places, to interact with people, and to be part of institutions that are not part of their experience. And as a result, they learn something about their experience they wouldn't have learned otherwise. So that's the second thing. And I have to applaud the late Don Bushnell, who got the number of fielding students every year to go to the Czech Republic to see how a nation newly released from the Soviet sphere was going to build its democracy. And that did a lot for a lot of those students who participated. And there are other students at Fielding and colleagues who've done that. So that impetus really does help a great deal for us to appreciate the shared humanity that we're part of and that we deal with. So I have to thank my students and the leadership at Fielding. I'm going back 31 years now, and I got a grant from Fielding to go to Maastricht, the Netherlands, to witness the signing of the European Community Treaty in 1993. And people say, why would you want to do that, given what's going on and given the history of Europe and the colonies and so on and so forth? I said, the answer was to understand better what the experience with the colonies and so on ultimately was going to mean. And I have to thank Fielding for that, because there was no other way for me to get out there. But it changed my perspective on foreign policy, on human rights, on collective action, any number of other things. So those things I think help process, and also to realize that this is a never-ending struggle. I mean, there's going to be something that we'll need to recognize, come to grips with next month, next year, that we haven't before. So we have to get ready for it. You never get to a point where it's all done, thank you, and goodbye.
It's more of a journey than an ending, it sounds like.
That's right. That's right.
So, and we're on this journey together, hand in hand, indeed. You mentioned something in your response about going to Maastricht and reflecting on colonization. And there's a lot of talk right now in the academy and probably in public discourse about decolonization. And people have different understandings about what that means. But I would be very curious from your perspective, as a person who has studied the history of the civil rights movement and Black history in general, where do you see decolonization fitting in, and why is that so important?
Critical, because I think one of the first steps of decolonization is to decolonize your mind, because it's the mentality that you have that predisposes you to think that you can marginalize and colonize a person, a group, an institution without consequence. Our biggest agenda right now in the United States is Washington, D.C., which is a colony. And one of the privileges that we have at the global session coming up is that the organizers have allowed us to do a session on Washington, D.C., its current status, where it's going, and where the struggle for full voting representation and statehood exists. All of the things that we've resisted, that we fought against in our struggle to get voting rights, et cetera, some of those things are still in place in Washington, D.C. And people don't realize up until 1961, citizens, no matter what color you were, if you were in Washington, D.C., you could not vote in presidential elections. The 23rd Amendment allowed that. We didn't get any kind of self-governance until 1973. That's 51 years ago, when the district passed or when the Congress passed the Home Rule Act. So we still have a ways to go. We still have not approved, number one, the emancipation of Washington, D.C. And we have not seated the Cherokee representative that we promised back in 1835. I mean, there's a whole list of things right here in the country that represent colonization and the artifacts of colonization that we haven't fully addressed yet. So let's start here at home, and let's be open to some inspiration to examples from abroad. Now, we have many terrible examples from abroad, but we do have things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa and Rwanda, and even in Croatia and Serbia. We don't have anything like that. There are some countries that pay the former folks who were oppressed reparations. The only time we've done reparations is $25,000 a head for the survivors of the internment camps during World War II who were Japanese, 127,000 of them. So, we have some things to do right on our own backyard on this issue, as well as to be open to inspiration from examples around the world.
I'm curious, just to follow up on your comment, you're lifting up human rights in all the things that you're saying here, and it's a reminder, I think, to all of us that the power of the civil rights movement was really a human rights movement, and it had repercussions and ripples all over the world. It influenced
Absolutely. Absolutely.
many movements in many countries and liberation movements all over the world. I think as we're coming to the close, I see we have just one other question, and I'm going to allow that question to be answered. So, because I was going to bring us to a close, but what are your thoughts on cancel culture and the possibility to healing? Because healing is so important for this work.
Absolutely. And I think first of all, some of us wouldn't recognize healing if we saw it or experienced it. And just coming out of my Christian background, I'm reminded that every time that Jesus was reported to have healed someone, he never said, Allison, you were a mess, girl, before I found you. Never said that. He said, Allison, your faith has healed you. So if you don't have that equipment, if you don't have that faith and that spirit, you are not a good candidate for any kind of healing. Okay. Second, if your healing involves the cancellation of somebody else, especially their spiritual side, you are not really being healed. Yeah. And the third piece I believe is critical to recognize is that this is not a one-shot situation. Yes, we heard that Jesus healed these people of their physical ailments, but their conversions were permanent and eternal. So whatever we do in the name of change and advocacy and the welfare of our fellow human beings has to be permanent and eternal.
Thank you. That's very important. I'm thinking as we are coming to a close here, there was one individual who had a question, and I am not seeing it in the chat. I'm kind of going through it. And hold on. Let's see if it comes up at all. They just reminded me. An individual asked, we have seen with the Palestine issue, the US government's redefining of anti-Semitism. Can you draw a parallel to Black history?
Absolutely, and this is coming from one of my dearest colleagues, and that's Meryem. I'm happy she raised it. Having been in Israel and Palestine, there are many parallels to be drawn. One was the question of a promised land, right? And what a promised land means to some people and doesn't mean to other people, right? We were promised freedom, but we still haven't achieved it yet, right? And we were the victims of what Palestine has gone through with land grabbing and moving into land that wasn't really yours in the first place, in the name of someone else's freedom, right? So there's that parallel. We have also seen religion used to justify the injustices there in Palestine and Israel, as well as here in the United States in the history of race. Religion was often used to justify the actions, the institutions, and the strategies of people who oppressed us. So there's that parallel. And the massive deaths, loss of life in both places, both situations. We don't have an exact number of Black people who died one way or another as a result of slavery and racial oppression over the years, but it's got to be in the multiple millions. And the same thing is happening in Palestine, where you had, in the name of defending oneself, the deaths of 1,200, 1,300 people, you killed 45,000 people. And now, the question is, are you going to be available to help them rebuild their families, their communities, their institutions? So there are a lot of parallels there, many, many parallels. And that's why I'm glad that we have in our community folks who are thoroughly enough familiar with what's going on there in Palestine and Israel to remind us of the connection. And then, of course, when we go to Michigan, we have an opportunity to talk even more in depth with Palestinian Americans who are going through discrimination and marginalization here to accompany what's going on with their relatives and their kinfolk in Palestine itself. So I appreciate that question.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. And, as we come to a close, I think there's just one last question, and I do think it begs answering because we do work for a higher education institution. Could you elaborate on ways academia and the community at large can come together to impactfully not just learn about the movements of American descendants of enslaved Africans, but also uplift and pour into the Black communities, especially in education, self-worth, and wellness?
Yeah, I think one of the things that our Black Student Union is doing and our scholars across the institution are doing is they are affirming and uplifting and, where possible, even materially supporting the research and scholarship that is going on, because we need to know in order to act well. And if we don't know well, we won't act well. So I think that's one thing we can do. The other thing, of course, is to do our work in the name of the community, not just ourselves. So one of the things I enjoy, we had a dissertation defense last night focusing on the work of Marva Collins, who was a very dynamic and original educator in the Chicago area. We want to uplift people like this, people like Henry Fowler, who taught us about Navajo math, people like Jaime Escalante, who taught calculus to people that even the teachers didn't think could absorb the principles of calculus. And they ended up scoring these high scores on the AP calculus test. So finding those examples and uplifting them and documenting them is one major contribution that we can make to carrying on the work here.
Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Henderson, so much for joining us today. This was a very informative talk, and there were excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but I appreciate everyone's participation in this event. I believe we're coming to a close and wish
Thank you as well. Thank you as well. Thank you, Dr. Rogers, Dr. Williams, all of those who, Dr. Mink, well, those who made it possible for us to do this. So we want to thank you and our student colleagues. And by the way, just quickly, we have students who have graduated from Fielding who are doing this work in a very distinguished way. I see Dr. Mulhauser on the call. She's created an institution to sustain, perpetuate, and diversify this work. I can go down a list of students who are out there doing what we call God's work at Fielding.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful Juneteenth. Bye-bye.
Thank you.